I want to look at something that I talked about several years ago with some of our leaders, network leaders, and key leaders, and something that I want to use again, because if you take the scriptures and you read them with an open mind, you begin to not only understand what God once did, you begin to understand what God is doing. And you can begin to apply that to your lives, as I know every one of you do, and you begin to see incredible parallels. And I see parallels in the 37th chapter of Genesis with a story of another dreamer, a guy named Joseph, who was one of the youngest of the sons of Jacob, who had a dream, and I want to tell that story. If you open up the 37th chapter, 5th verse, you read, Joseph had a dream. Now you go on and read some more, but I want to say that this thing so long ago was a dream that was initiated by God. He didn't create it. He didn't think it up. It was something that God gave because God purposed to do something. And that dream became a catalyst for something enormous and something that was far beyond what Joseph understood at the time. He truly didn't. He just hears the dream. And he began to say, whoa. And he began to share it with some people. They didn't understand it. He didn't understand it, but it was a dream that God had given. If you move down to chapter 37, verse 8, you read, well, his brother said to him, do you intend to reign over us? And they hated Joseph, all the more because of his dream and what he said. And when he told his father, that would be Jacob, as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him. Now, I'm reading from the scripture, the 37th chapter of Genesis. And I want to say that sometimes dreams produce rejection. We're not the first ones that this has happened with. It's happened before. And we can learn from the scriptures and say, whoa, God is on the move in a similar way today. And in this case, it was rejection among his closest friends and kin, his own family, his own dad. It was a remarkable kind of thing. The head of the clan actually was not blessed by the dream. Now, of course, we experienced that with the Archbishop of Canterbury 7.5 years ago, who was not blessed by the dream. We were rebuked just as much. But the point is, if God purposes to do this and God gives the dream, watch out. Something mighty is about to unfold. So, what we saw was that the head rejected it. The dream became something very risky to even share and talk about because even the closest family, friends, and kin were not blessed by anything that was said. No one basically wanted to hear the stuff. That was Joseph's experience because it was an offense. It was an offense. Who do you think you are? And don't you understand those older and more in charge than you know what they're doing? So it was an offense. If you get down to chapter 37, verse 13, you read, Israel said to Joseph, Jacob said to Joseph, your brothers are grazing the flocks. Come, I'm going to send you to them. Go and see if all is well. And he sent Joseph off. Verse 18, when his brothers saw him in the distance and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Okay, I want to say that Joseph's obedience to his father, I want you to go out in the field and check on the brothers, actually produced more rejection, increased rejection. They wanted to kill him. And that's the tragedy so often with a dream. It is not always well embraced. Verse 19 and 20, if you keep reading through this. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him. Then we'll see what comes of his dream. Well, they came to despise not only the dream, which they had indicated earlier that they were not blessed by, but they came to despise the dreamer as well. Do you see any parallels with what God has done with us in these last 7.5 years? God is doing something. This is sovereign. And we've had to go through some of the same challenging moments. Those who have no dream of themselves, in this case, the brothers, often want to kill the dream. What we have to do is to stand firm, whether in our congregations, in our mission stations, in our leadership. And we have to understand that sometimes those that love us for other reasons are not blessed by the dream, and they're not blessed by the telling of the dream. Nevertheless, as so many years ago in the story of Jacob and his boys and Joseph, there's a work God purposes to do, and I want us to see it. So, verse, say, 37, 28. They sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites, and they took him to Egypt. What I want to say here, the parallel that I see that's just fascinating to me is Joseph was compelled to go to Africa. Africa? Never been to Africa. Don't know about Africa. I don't know what you want me here for. It was unplanned. It was unanticipated. And in some ways, it's not something he was excited about if you read the story. He was kind of compelled to go. Well, a new world began to open up for him when he got there. I'm not going to go through the whole story, but it was incredible, a new world. He had his ups and downs, had his moments, stumped toes and scuffed shins and all of that. It's a long story, but he was in Africa, believe it or not, compelled to go there, and a whole new thing began to develop. If you skip on through a little further here to chapter 39, verse 2, you read, "The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered." God guarded him. God guided him. God held him. God blessed him. In Africa, where is this coming from? God who held him and guarded him and blessed him. And Joseph didn't really see that coming. He didn't understand all the unfolding dynamics. But God has captured him and called him and led him, riding that wave that he does not control, and he does not know even where it's headed. But he ends up in Africa, and God prospered him. Although it was new turf and new territory and new relationships and new people that he did not know, God prospered it. Skip to chapter 41, say verse 37. Following a long story, he kind of got in hot water, and that's a long story, and he ended up in the dungeon, and he came out, and the Pharaoh was having some dreams, and he didn't understand the dreams, so they called Joseph up and said, do you know how to unpack these dreams? And he began to unpack the dream for them. Following all of that, when Pharaoh heard what Joseph said, you read in chapter 41, verse 37 following, Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, verse 40, you shall be in charge, and all my people will submit to your orders. In time, Joseph, who's an outsider, who's sort of compelled to be there, who doesn't understand exactly why he's there, in time, Joseph is given remarkable authority. Authority that he didn't even fully understand himself. And it reflects an enormous amount of trust from the leadership in Africa. Do you see the parallels that the House of Bishops and the Provincial Synod have given to this mission? Remarkable authority. They barely knew us. It's not really our country. And yet God has purposed to do something here. And as an outsider even, we have experienced tremendous trust. Tremendous trust. And I see that as a work of God. A work of God. And then chapter 42, say verse 1 and 2. Well, when Jacob learned that there was a grain in Egypt, see, there had been a famine and they were all hungry. He said to his sons, I've heard there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some of it for us. And then Joseph's brothers all went down to Egypt. So what you discover there is, by God's sovereign hand and God's providence, his brothers followed him to Africa. They didn't really understand the African piece either. There's a bite to eat down there. I'm going to grab something. So they go to Africa. And it's amazing. These are the ones that didn't like it. Thought it was a crazy thing. Well, now they're in Africa. Joseph, he didn't understand it, actually was used by God to pioneer a way forward into Africa. And his brothers followed him. And they ended up there as well. So get down to about, say, chapter 45, verse 4, and you're going to see once all the brothers are in Egypt, and see, Jacob sort of held back Benjamin because he and Joseph had been brothers from his favorite wife. It's a long story, I'm not going to go into it. But it gets to the point where everybody had gone there, and in chapter 45, you'll read Joseph is there. His brothers still don't recognize him, and you'll read these words. They're all in Africa. Joseph says, "Come close to me. I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. Do not be distressed." Very important. It was to save lives that God sent me. Sent me on ahead of you. God sent me ahead of you to preserve and to save lives. Verse 8 of chapter 45. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. And then verse 15, Joseph kissed all his brothers and wept over them.